You're useless trash, Kieran. My daughter deserves so much better than a deadbeat like you. Those words changed everything. In less than 24 hours, the man who called me worthless would be begging me to save his dying company. He had no idea he was insulting the one person who could rescue him from bankruptcy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Kieran Blackwood, and I'm 34 years old. For the past 9 years, I've been quietly building what most people would consider impossible. A logistics empire that moves over $300 million worth of goods across 3 continents every single month. My company, Obsidian Supply Chain Solutions, operates through a network of subsidiaries, holding companies, and regional partnerships so complex that even Fortune 500 executives who use our services have no idea they're dealing with me personally. I control shipping routes from Vancouver to Singapore, warehouse facilities in 12 major cities, and transportation contracts that keep some of the world's biggest retailers stocked and profitable. When Amazon needs emergency freight moved overnight, when Walmart faces a supply chain crisis, when tech companies need components rushed from overseas manufacturers, they call my network. They just don't know my name. That's exactly how I built it: invisible, efficient, indispensable. But right now, standing in my father-in-law's perfectly manicured backyard in suburban Toronto, watching him gesture wildly with his barbecue tongs like he's conducting some symphony of disappointment, I felt anything but powerful. Victor Ashford had been calling me useless for 2.5 years straight. Every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every time I walked through his front gate. The man treated me like I was some kind of charity case his daughter had dragged home from the street. "Look at Dr. Richardson's son-in-law," Victor continued, pointing the tongs toward my wife, Zara. "Just bought his wife a Tesla Model S cash. That's what a real provider looks like." Zara stood by the patio table, rearranging the napkins for the 3rd time. Same routine every visit. She'd find something to organize, something to keep her hands busy while her father tore me apart in front of the entire extended family. Never looked up, never said a word, just kept folding those damn napkins like they held the secret to making this nightmare end. "Kieran works in transportation, Dad," she finally mumbled, still focused on her meaningless task. "Transportation?" Victor scoffed, flipping a burger with unnecessary violence. "You know what that means, right? Probably drives a delivery truck or manages some warehouse shift. Blue-collar work." I watched him pace around his expensive outdoor kitchen setup, his face getting redder with each step. This was Victor Ashford, founder and CEO of Ashford Construction Group, a mid-sized commercial building company that had been struggling to secure major contracts for the past 18 months. He'd inherited seed money from his father's masonry business and somehow convinced himself that made him Toronto's next construction mogul. What Victor didn't know was that I'd been tracking his company's financial statements for 6 months. Ashford Construction Group was hemorrhaging cash, losing bids to larger competitors, and desperately searching for the kind of supply chain partnerships that could give them a competitive edge in material costs and delivery schedules. They needed exactly the kind of invisible logistics partner that I specialized in being. I met Zara 4 years ago at a supply chain conference in Montreal. She was presenting research on sustainable building materials for her master's thesis in environmental engineering. Brilliant, passionate, and completely absorbed in her work at a green technology consulting firm. I was there because I'd been considering investments in eco-friendly logistics solutions. What I didn't expect was to fall for the woman explaining carbon footprint reduction strategies. Our relationship moved quickly, maybe too quickly. Within 14 months, we were married in a small ceremony that Victor complained about for weeks. He wanted something bigger, more expensive, something that would impress his golf buddies at the Rosedale Country Club. But Zara and I preferred understated elegance. Or so I thought. The problem started during our first Thanksgiving as a married couple. Victor had too much wine and began interrogating me about my work. I gave him the same carefully vague answers I gave everyone: logistics coordination, supply chain consulting, transportation management for various clients. All technically true, but missing the crucial detail that I was the primary owner of the network. My business model was built on anonymity. Obsidian Supply Chain Solutions operated through 17 different subsidiary companies across North America and Asia. When a retailer needed emergency shipping from Shenzhen to their distribution center in Ohio, they'd contract with Pacific Freight Solutions. When a manufacturer needed warehouse space and inventory management, they'd work with Northern Logistics Group. All roads led back to me, but the paperwork was so layered that even experienced corporate lawyers took months to trace the connections. I'd learned early that being invisible meant being indispensable. No one could cut you out if they couldn't figure out who you were. But Victor interpreted my discretion as inadequacy. He started making comments about my mystery job and how a real man would be more transparent about his career. Zara would change the subject or make nervous jokes, but she never told him to stop, never stood up for me. The verbal attacks escalated over the following months. Victor would make cutting remarks about my clothes, my car, a modest Honda Civic that I drove because I preferred not to attract attention, and my apparent lack of ambition. He'd compare me to other men in their social circle, successful surgeons and lawyers who drove BMWs and talked loudly about their stock portfolios. What made it worse was watching Zara shrink during these confrontations. The confident engineer I'd married became apologetic and defensive, constantly making excuses for her father's behavior. She'd pull me aside after particularly brutal dinners and whisper promises that it would get better, that he just needed time to warm up to me. But she never confronted him directly, never drew a line in the sand. 4 months ago, while researching potential partnerships in the construction industry, I discovered something that changed everything. I came across Ashford Construction Group's recent bid documents and financial statements. The company was in serious trouble, hemorrhaging cash on failed projects and losing contracts to competitors who could deliver materials faster and cheaper. They'd approached dozens of logistics companies, but their cash flow problems scared away most serious partners. That's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could help save Victor's company through an anonymous partnership, or I could let market forces decide its fate. The businessman in me saw the potential profit. The son-in-law in me saw something else entirely. I started conducting quiet due diligence on Ashford Construction Group, keeping my identity buried behind layers of corporate structure. Victor would never know that his potential salvation was sitting at his dinner table, listening to his insults, watching his daughter stay silent. The pattern of disrespect had become predictable. Every family gathering followed the same script. Victor would start with subtle digs about my appearance or my car, then escalate to direct comparisons with more successful men in their social circle. Zara would find busy work, organizing something, cleaning something, anything to avoid eye contact while her father dismantled my character in front of relatives. 2 months ago, during Zara's cousin's engagement party, Victor introduced me to his brother-in-law Malcolm, a pharmaceutical sales manager who wouldn't stop talking about his recent promotion. Malcolm just got promoted to regional director, Victor announced as we stood around the appetizer table. Manages a team of 42 sales reps across eastern Canada. Big responsibility. Malcolm laughed and clapped me on the shoulder. What about you, Kieran? Moving up in the transportation world. I should have seen it coming. Victor's eyes lit up with that familiar gleam that meant he was about to go in for the kill. Kieran's more of a steady-as-she-goes type, Victor said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Aren't you, Kieran? No big promotions or career changes. Just keeping things simple. Zara squeezed my arm under the table, a warning to stay calm. But Victor wasn't finished. I mean, let's be realistic here, he continued, addressing Malcolm but speaking loud enough for nearby relatives to hear. My daughter is a brilliant environmental engineer. She's consulted for 3 provincial governments on sustainability policies. She could have married a doctor, a lawyer, someone with real prospects and ambition. He gestured vaguely in my direction. Instead, she settled for, well, we all make compromises, don't we? The conversation around us gradually stopped. Malcolm stared at his plate like it contained the secrets of the universe. Zara's cousin pretended to be fascinated by something across the room. Even the catering staff seemed to slow down, sensing the tension. I looked at Zara, really looked at her. She was staring at her lap, her face flushed with embarrassment. Not embarrassment for her father's behavior, but embarrassment for me. For being married to someone her father considered beneath the family's standards. That's when I understood this wasn't going to improve. Zara wasn't going to stand up for me because, deep down, she agreed with him. Maybe not completely, but enough to stay silent. Enough to let him tear me down in front of her family while she rearranged napkins and avoided eye contact. I excused myself to the bathroom and spent 10 minutes staring at my reflection in the mirror, thinking about the Ashford Construction Group partnership documents sitting on my desk at home. A $12 million logistics contract that would solve all of Victor's cash flow problems and secure his company's future for the next 5 years. The paperwork was ready. All it needed was my signature. When I returned to the party, Victor was holding court near the bar, telling Malcolm about his latest construction project. A small office complex in Mississauga that was running 3 weeks behind schedule because of supply chain delays. It's impossible to find reliable logistics partners these days, Victor was saying. Everyone promises the world, then disappears when you need them most. That's the problem with this industry. Too many small-time operators who don't understand what real business looks like. I stood there listening to him complain about exactly the kind of problems I solved every day for companies 10 times larger than his, and I made my decision. The next morning, I drove to my office in downtown Toronto and pulled out the Ashford Construction Group files. What I found confirmed everything I'd suspected about Victor's business management skills. The company had been bleeding money for 8 months, ever since a disastrous project in Hamilton, where Victor had ignored his project manager's warnings about supply delivery schedules. He'd promised the client completion by a specific date, then discovered that his material suppliers couldn't meet the timeline. The resulting delays had cost Ashford Construction nearly $400,000 in penalty fees and lost them their relationship with 2 major suppliers. But instead of accepting responsibility, Victor had blamed his project team, fired his logistics coordinator, and started shopping for new partners who could magically solve problems that stemmed from his own poor planning. What made it even more frustrating was that Zara had been indirectly involved in the disaster. She'd done environmental impact assessments for the Hamilton project and had flagged potential delivery issues in her preliminary report. She'd specifically mentioned that the sustainable materials Victor wanted to use required longer lead times and more complex shipping arrangements. Victor had dismissed her concerns as typical academic overcaution. When the project failed exactly as she'd predicted, he'd made her professional life so difficult that she'd eventually stopped taking contracts from his company. Zara had never told me the full story. She'd mentioned some disagreements with her father about project timelines, but she'd framed it as a difference of professional opinion rather than what it really was: Victor's arrogance overruling sound engineering judgment. I called David Chen, one of Victor's former project managers who'd been let go after the Hamilton disaster. David and I had crossed paths at industry conferences, and he'd always been straightforward about the challenges of working in construction logistics. "David, this is Kieran Blackwood. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Kieran? Not at all. How's Zara doing?" "She's fine, thanks. I'm actually calling about something business-related. I'm researching Ashford Construction Group for a potential partnership, and I wanted to get your perspective on their operational capabilities." David was quiet for a moment. "Kieran, can I speak candidly?" "Please do." "Victor Ashford is a disaster waiting to happen. Good people, solid local reputation, but the man has no business managing complex logistics. He treats supply chain coordination like it's some kind of afterthought, then panics when reality doesn't match his optimistic timelines." "Can you give me a specific example?" "The Hamilton project. We had 6 weeks of planning data showing that the eco-friendly materials he wanted to use required specialized shipping and longer lead times. Zara had done a beautiful analysis explaining exactly why we needed to adjust our timeline. Victor ignored it, promised the client we could deliver on schedule, and cost the company nearly $500,000 when everything went sideways. What happened to the team after that? Victor blamed everyone except himself, said we were being negative and uncommitted to the company's success, made the work environment so toxic that 3 of us left within 2 months. Honestly, it broke my heart. That company could be really successful with better leadership. After I hung up, I sat in my office until nearly midnight, thinking about everything David had told me. Victor hadn't just insulted me at family dinners. He'd undermined Zara's professional expertise because it conflicted with his ego-driven decision-making. The $12 million logistics partnership I'd been preparing would solve his supply chain problems and validate his belief that he'd been right all along. It would reward years of poor judgment and arrogant leadership. More importantly, it would mean that Zara would never have to choose between her father and her husband. She could keep both relationships intact, never confronting the fact that she'd stayed silent while he tore me down. But now, she was going to have to choose. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago during a family barbecue to celebrate Victor's 58th birthday. We were at his house in North Toronto, and he'd invited his golf buddy Thomas, a real estate developer who loved talking about his latest property acquisitions. Thomas just closed on a waterfront development in Oakville, Victor announced as we gathered around his outdoor kitchen. 12 luxury condos, pre-sales already at 80%. That's what real business success looks like. Thomas laughed and raised his beard toward me. What about you, Kieran? Any big deals lately? New routes, major contracts? I should have seen it coming. Victor's entire posture changed, like a predator sensing wounded prey. Kieran doesn't make those kinds of deals, Victor said, his voice filled with mock sympathy. He's more of a day-to-day operations guy, aren't you, Kieran? Keeping things running smoothly. Zara was arranging fruit on a platter, her movements becoming more aggressive with each passing second, a warning sign I'd learned to recognize. But Victor wasn't finished. He never was. I mean, let's be honest here, he continued, addressing Thomas but speaking loud enough for the entire backyard to hear. My daughter is a brilliant environmental engineer. She's designed sustainability systems for major corporations, consulted for government agencies. She could have married anyone, a doctor, a successful lawyer, someone with real vision and ambition. He gestured toward me with his spatula. Instead, she settled for a transportation coordinator who drives a Honda Civic and rents an apartment in Scarborough. The backyard went silent. Thomas stared at his beer like it contained the meaning of life. Zara's sister pretended to be fascinated by something in the garden. Even the neighbor's dog seemed to sense the tension and stopped barking. I looked at Zara, really looked at her. She was gripping the edge of the fruit platter, her knuckles white with tension. But she wasn't angry at her father. She was angry at the situation, angry at being put in this position, angry at having to be embarrassed by her husband's apparent inadequacy in front of the family. That's when I understood. This wasn't going to get better because Zara didn't want it to get better. She wanted it to go away. She wanted me to either become the successful man her father approved of, or she wanted to stop having to defend her choice to marry beneath her family's expectations. I stood up slowly, placed my napkin on the patio table, and looked directly at Victor. You're absolutely right, I said. She does deserve better. I kissed Zara on the forehead, grabbed my jacket from the chair, and walked toward the front yard. Behind me, I heard Zara calling my name, but I didn't turn around. I had 3 messages to send. The drive home gave me time to think clearly for the first time in months. For nearly a year, I'd been secretly preparing partnership documents for Ashford Construction Group, a comprehensive logistics solution that would cut their material costs by 30% and reduce project delivery times by 3 weeks on average. The contract was worth $12 million over 5 years, with options for expansion into specialized eco-friendly shipping that aligned perfectly with Zara's environmental expertise. It would save Victor's company and position them as leaders in sustainable construction practices. The paperwork was sitting on my desk at home, reviewed by lawyers, approved by my board of directors, ready for signature. All Victor needed was an anonymous logistics partner who could solve his supply chain problems and give him the competitive edge he'd been desperately seeking. I pulled into my driveway, sat in the car for 15 minutes, and made my decision. I wasn't going to sign those documents. In fact, I was going to do something much more educational. I was going to let Victor Ashford learn exactly what it felt like to need someone he considered useless trash. I walked into my home office and called my business attorney, Sarah Martinez, who'd been handling the Ashford construction negotiations for months. Sarah, it's Kieran. I need you to draft 3 documents for me. At 9 p.m. on a Saturday, this must be important. A formal withdrawal of partnership interest in Ashford Construction Group. A notice of contract termination for the pending logistics agreement. and a confidentiality release that will allow me to reveal my identity as the negotiating party. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Kieran, are you sure about this? We've spent 8 months structuring this deal. The profit projections are excellent despite their current cash flow issues. I'm sure. Sometimes the best business decision is the one you don't make. This is about your father-in-law, isn't it? Sarah had been my attorney for 6 years. She knew about my preference for anonymous partnerships, and she'd figured out the family connection months ago. This is about respect and consequences, I said. All right. I'll have everything ready by Monday morning. Do you want me to deliver the withdrawal notice personally? Yes, I want it delivered to Victor Ashford at exactly 10 a.m. on Monday. I want him to have a full day to panic before he understands what happened. By midnight, I had everything I needed. Sarah would deliver the contract termination to Ashford Construction at 10 a.m. Monday morning. At exactly the same time, my scheduled messages would be sent to both Zara and to Victor, along with a third message from Sarah's office explaining the legal implications. By Tuesday afternoon, everyone would know exactly who they'd been dealing with. That night, I went through the Ashford Construction files one more time. What I found confirmed everything I'd suspected about Victor's leadership approach. The company had been hemorrhaging money not because of market conditions, but because of his consistent pattern of ignoring expert advice and making ego-driven decisions. The Hamilton project disaster was just the most recent example. Over the past 3 years, Victor had overruled his project managers 17 times, resulting in cost overruns, delivery delays, and client complaints. Each time he'd blamed his team rather than examining his own decision-making process. But what made it personal was realizing that Zara had been one of the experts he'd consistently ignored. Her environmental impact assessments had been accurate, her timeline predictions had been correct, and her recommendations had been sound. Victor had dismissed her professional expertise because it came from his daughter, someone he saw as brilliant but impractical. Now he was going to learn what happened when you consistently dismissed the people trying to help you succeed. Sunday morning, I woke up early and drove to my office to prepare for what would either be the most satisfying business decision of my career or the most expensive personal vendetta in Toronto's logistics industry. I reviewed the withdrawal documents one final time. Everything was legally sound. Ashford Construction Group had been negotiating with Obsidian Supply Chain Solutions through a series of subsidiary companies, never knowing they were dealing with their daughter's husband. The confidentiality agreements we'd signed worked both ways. I was just as protected from revealing my identity as they were from having their financial details exposed. But I was about to waive that protection voluntarily. Sarah had drafted 3 separate documents: the formal contract termination, a comprehensive explanation of why the partnership was being dissolved, and a detailed financial impact assessment that would make it clear exactly what Ashford Construction was losing. The numbers were staggering. Without the Obsidian partnership, Victor's company would lose access to preferred shipping rates that would have saved them $180,000 annually. They'd lose priority delivery scheduling that could have reduced their project timelines by 15 to 20%. Most importantly, they'd lose the specialized, eco-friendly logistics network that would have positioned them as leaders in sustainable construction. Instead, they'd be back to negotiating with second-tier logistics providers who charged premium rates for standard service. At 2 p.m., I called Zara. She'd been staying at her sister's house since Saturday night, and I could tell from her voice that she'd been crying. "Kieran, I'm so sorry about yesterday. Dad went too far." He did. He wants to apologize. Maybe we could have dinner next weekend, just the 3 of us. Try to start over. I almost laughed. Start over. As if 3 years of systematic humiliation could be erased with one awkward dinner. "Zara, how long have you been ashamed of me?" The question caught her off guard. "What? I'm not ashamed." "You've never once told your father to stop insulting me. Not once in 3 years. He called me useless trash in front of your entire family yesterday. You said nothing. He doesn't mean it the way it sounds. He's just protective." "Protective of what? Your decision to marry someone he considers beneath your family's standards?" Zara started crying. "That's not fair. What's not fair is watching your husband get torn apart for 3 years while you rearrange fruit platters and pretend it's not happening. I didn't know what to say. He gets so angry when people confront him. So you chose his comfort over my dignity. The silence stretched between us for nearly a minute. I love you, she finally said, which somehow made everything worse. I know you do, but love isn't enough when you won't fight for it. After I hung up, I finalized the 3 messages that would be sent Monday morning at exactly 10 a.m. The first would go to Zara, explaining who her husband really was and what her father had just lost. The second would go to Victor, letting him know that his salvation had been sitting at his dinner table, listening to his insults. The third would come from Sarah's law office, confirming the legal termination of the partnership and the financial implications. By Monday afternoon, Victor would understand what it meant to need someone he'd spent 3 years calling worthless. Monday morning, I arrived at my office early and made one final review of the contract termination documents. Everything was in order. At exactly 9:45 a.m., I called Zara. Kieran, is everything all right? You never call this early. I need to tell you something important, but I want you to sit down first. You're scaring me. I'm the anonymous logistics partner your father's been negotiating with for the past 8 months. My company, Obsidian Supply Chain Solutions, was prepared to sign a $12 million partnership agreement with Ashford Construction Group. I terminated the contract this morning. Complete silence. I could hear her breathing, but no words. What are you talking about? You work in transportation coordination. You don't own a company. Zara, I own Obsidian Supply Chain Solutions. We manage logistics networks worth over $300 million annually. I've been the anonymous partner your father's been courting for months. That's impossible. You drive a Honda Civic. Check your phone. You're going to receive a text message in exactly 10 minutes with legal documentation confirming everything I just told you. So will your father. I could hear her breathing getting faster and shallower. This doesn't make sense. If you have that kind of money, why didn't you ever tell me? Because I didn't need you to know, and because I wanted to see how your family would treat someone they thought was beneath them. So this is what? Some kind of test? No, it was going to be a business partnership right up until your father called me useless trash in front of your entire family, and you said nothing. Zara started crying. I should have defended you. I know that. But Kieran, this is my father's company. You can't destroy it because your feelings got hurt. This isn't about my feelings, Zara. It's about respect and consequences. Your father spent 3 years insulting someone who could have saved his business, and you spent 3 years letting it happen. Please don't do this. We can fix things. I'll talk to him. I'll make him apologize. It's too late for apologies. At exactly 10 a.m., my phone buzzed with confirmations that all 3 messages had been delivered simultaneously. Zara's phone chimed at the same time. Oh my God, she whispered. Kieran, please, I'm begging you. Don't destroy my father. I'm not destroying him, Zara. I'm letting him face the consequences of his own choices. This is cruel. What's cruel is watching your husband get humiliated for 3 years and never once standing up to stop it. Zara hung up. 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was Victor, and he was screaming before I even said hello. You son of a bitch. You think this is funny? You think you can destroy my company because I hurt your precious feelings? Mr. Ashford, I think you've misunderstood the situation. I've misunderstood nothing. Zara told me everything. You're the logistics partner. You're the one who pulled out. That's correct. 37 people work for me, Kieran. 37 families depend on this company. You're willing to destroy all of them because I said some things you didn't like? Actually, Mr. Ashford, I'm willing to let your company succeed or fail based on its own merits, without my network subsidizing your operational inefficiencies. We had a deal. We had preliminary negotiations that I chose not to finalize. No laws were broken. No contracts were violated. Victor was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller. What do you want? Nothing, Mr. Ashford. I don't want anything from you. There has to be something. Money, an apology, what? I want you to understand what it feels like to need someone you consider useless trash. I hung up and turned off my phone. It was over. 3 days later, Zara came to the house while I was at work and packed her belongings. She left a letter on the kitchen counter that was 3 pages long, but the message was simple. She couldn't be married to someone who would deliberately hurt her family, even if her family had hurt me first. What she didn't mention in the letter was that she'd also cut off all contact with her father. I found out from David Chen, who'd heard it from another former Ashford construction employee. Zara had confronted Victor about his treatment of me, and when he tried to justify his behavior, she'd unloaded 3 years of suppressed frustration about his business decisions, his treatment of his employees, and his systematic dismissal of expert advice. According to David, the conversation had ended with Zara telling her father that his arrogance had destroyed her marriage and undermined her professional credibility, and that she never wanted to work with him again. Victor had called her 23 times since then. She hadn't answered once. Meanwhile, news of Ashford Construction's partnership collapse had spread through Toronto's construction community. 2 other potential logistics partners had withdrawn their proposals, spooked by the company's apparent instability and the mysterious circumstances surrounding the contract termination. Victor was forced to lay off 12 employees and cancel 3 upcoming projects. The company's main office moved from their downtown location to a smaller space in an industrial park near the airport. The landscaping service that maintained Victor's house was canceled. The country club membership was suspended. Everything was being liquidated to buy time. I drove past the Ashford Construction office one afternoon and saw Victor loading boxes into his car from what used to be the reception area. He looked older, defeated somehow, like a man who'd finally run out of other people to blame for his problems. The local construction trade magazine ran a story about the company's struggles, focusing on the sudden departure of their primary logistics partner and the resulting operational challenges. Victor refused to comment, but the article quoted several former employees who painted a picture of a company struggling with leadership issues and poor strategic planning. By the end of the month, Victor had put his house on the market and was liquidating his personal investments to keep the company operational. The BMW was replaced with a used Toyota. The annual golf trip to Florida was canceled. Everything that had once represented his success was being sold to fund his survival. 6 months later, I received word that Ashford Construction Group had declared bankruptcy. Victor had managed to find a buyer for some of their equipment and client contracts, but the company itself was finished. The remaining employees were either laid off or absorbed by the acquiring firm. Victor himself had taken a project management position with a larger construction company, working out of a cubicle in a suburban office complex. The man who'd spent years lecturing me about ambition and success was now commuting to the kind of anonymous corporate environment he'd once mocked. The house in North Toronto sold for $200,000 less than the asking price. Victor and his wife moved to a townhouse in Mississauga, downsizing from their 4-bedroom suburban palace to a modest 2-bedroom unit with no backyard for entertaining. The country club membership was gone. The golf buddies who used to listen to his business advice were now avoiding his calls. The family barbecues where he'd held court while tearing me down were replaced by quiet dinners for 2 at chain restaurants. Zara never reached out to me directly, but I heard through mutual contacts that she'd taken a position with an environmental consulting firm in Vancouver. She was doing well, publishing research papers and speaking at conferences again. She'd found her professional voice, even if she'd never found it in our marriage. I received one piece of communication from her, a brief email 6 months after she'd moved to Vancouver. She thanked me for not making the divorce proceedings difficult and acknowledged that her father's treatment of me had been wrong. But she also made it clear that she couldn't forgive me for what she saw as a deliberately cruel response to family dysfunction. She was probably right. I could have handled things differently. I could have revealed my identity without destroying the business partnership. I could have used my position to demand respect, rather than to teach lessons about consequences. But I'd spent 3 years watching the woman I loved choose her father's comfort over my dignity, and I decided that some lessons were worth the cost. I sold my Toronto office and relocated Obsidian Supply Chain Solutions to Vancouver, where the Pacific Rim shipping opportunities offered better growth potential. The change of scenery was good for me, and the West Coast logistics market was hungry for the kind of innovative partnerships I specialized in creating. The Toronto construction industry had been good to me in an unexpected way. Word had spread about Victor's partnership collapse, but not about my role in it. Several construction companies had approached me directly, looking for the kind of logistics solutions that could give them competitive advantages in bidding and project delivery. I never mentioned the Ashford construction connection. Business was business. Meanwhile, Victor's decline continued in predictable stages. The project management job lasted 8 months before the company downsized and eliminated his position. He found work with a smaller firm, then an even smaller one. Each step down accompanied by reduced salary and diminished responsibilities. The construction trade magazines that used to quote him as an industry expert now featured articles about the dangers of poor logistics planning, often using unnamed case studies that sounded suspiciously familiar. Victor had become a cautionary tale, though no one connected his story to the quiet logistics executive who'd once sat silently through his family dinners. 2 years after the bankruptcy, I received an unexpected email from Thomas, Victor's former golf buddy who'd been at the birthday barbecue. He was writing to ask if I might be interested in providing logistics consulting for his real estate development company. "I remember you mentioned working in transportation," he wrote. "Victor always said you were in day-to-day operations, but I'm looking for someone who understands the bigger picture. Would you be interested in discussing a potential partnership?" The irony was perfect. Thomas was approaching me for exactly the kind of strategic consulting that Victor had dismissed as day-to-day operations, not realizing he was contacting the same person who'd been insulted at his friend's barbecue. I politely declined, citing scheduling conflicts, but the exchange confirmed what I'd suspected. Victor's reputation in Toronto's business community was permanently damaged. He'd become someone that former associates mentioned in cautionary terms rather than as a potential partner. 6 months later, I heard that Victor and his wife had moved to a small apartment in Hamilton, where he'd found work as a construction supervisor for a residential building company. The man who'd once lectured me about success and ambition was now taking orders from project managers younger than his daughter. 3 years after that fateful birthday barbecue, I received a letter forwarded from my old Toronto address. The return address showed a Hamilton apartment complex, and the handwriting was shaky but familiar. Victor had written to apologize. The letter was 4 pages long, written on plain notebook paper rather than the expensive letterhead he'd once used for his construction company. In it, he acknowledged that his treatment of me had been wrong, that his behavior at family gatherings had been cruel and unnecessary, and that he understood why I'd responded the way I did. But what struck me most was the final paragraph. "I've learned what it feels like to be dismissed by people who hold your future in their hands. I've learned what it means to need help from people who have every reason to refuse you. I've learned that respect isn't something you can demand based on age or position. It's something you earn through how you treat others, especially when you think they can't fight back. I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to understand what you tried to show me." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't request a meeting or suggest that we try to rebuild any kind of relationship. He simply acknowledged that he'd been wrong and that he understood the lesson I'd taught him. I never responded to the letter, but I kept it. A year later, I heard that Victor had started a small handyman business, working alone and taking jobs that the larger construction companies considered too small to bother with. He was making enough to support himself and his wife in their modest apartment, but he'd never again be the successful business owner who held court at family gatherings. Zara and I never reconciled. She built a successful career in Vancouver's environmental consulting industry, eventually starting her own firm that specialized in sustainable development practices. I saw her name in trade publications occasionally, quoted as an expert on green building technologies. We moved in the same professional circles but never crossed paths directly. I heard through mutual contacts that she'd eventually married an environmental lawyer who shared her passion for sustainability work. They seemed happy together, and I was genuinely glad she'd found someone who appreciated her expertise. As for me, Obsidian Supply Chain Solutions continued to grow. We expanded into sustainable logistics solutions, helping companies reduce their carbon footprints while improving delivery efficiency. The work was satisfying in ways that went beyond financial success. I never remarried, but I dated occasionally and maintained close friendships with people who knew exactly who I was and what I did for a living. I learned to value relationships built on honesty rather than mystery. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how I handled the situation with Victor, if I regret destroying a man's business and marriage over what some might consider wounded pride. The answer is complicated. I regret that Zara got caught in the middle of a conflict she didn't create. I regret that 37 employees lost their jobs because of their boss's character flaws. I regret that a situation that could have been resolved with basic human respect escalated into mutual destruction. But I don't regret teaching Victor Ashford what it felt like to be powerless. I don't regret showing him the consequences of treating people as disposable based on his assumptions about their worth. Sometimes the best revenge isn't planning elaborate schemes or seeking dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's simply stepping back and letting someone face the natural consequences of their own character. And sometimes the most useless person in the room turns out to be the one holding all the cards.